Are you tired of all these repetitive speedrun levels? Are refreshing levels just not satisfying anymore? Are Kaizo levels just too difficult and punishing? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you should play more traditional Mario levels. These are the types of levels that replicate the same design principles that you see not only in Mario games, but in pretty much any video game with levels in it. In contrast to Kaizo levels, where the player must follow the critical path laid by the developer, traditional level design makes use of choices, challenges, and risk versus reward. The player is presented with a challenge, and then given several actions that they can take to overcome the challenge. In this video, we will learn the basics of level design, along with advanced tips for making Mario levels and how to balance and tweak levels based on feedback. The first basic principle of level design is risk versus reward. This is the idea that harder or more challenging paths should yield higher rewards. As a player, it feels great to take a risk and have it pay off. One of the ways that players can express themselves in games is how much risk they are willing to take. Mario games are designed to where every action the player takes carries some risk and reward. An iconic example includes kicking a Koopa shell to defeat enemies. In order to earn an extra life, Mario needs to run quickly to keep up with the shell, but at any point, the shell can hit something and turn around, threatening to hurt the player if they don't get out of the way. Even holding onto a power-up poses some increased risk. When Mario grabs a mushroom, he's able to take an extra hit before dying, but the mushroom also makes him taller, which actually makes it easier for him to get hit and lose the power-up. This means mushrooms have an inherent risk to them, making them a far more interesting mechanic. There are several different ways to reward players after completing challenges, from coins to power-ups to shortcuts to extra lives. It is important to balance the reward the player receives for doing a challenge. If you make the player work for a power-up, then the power-up will become more satisfying to collect, and the player will feel justified for going out of their way to collect it. Let's look at an example of how to balance risk versus reward. In this level, I have introduced cannons to the player that fire projectiles. This final room is filled with them, and the player needs to make it to the pipe to reach the boss at the end of the level. Right before this area, there's a power-up in this block that is trivial to collect. To make this power-up more balanced, we'll move it to be inside these blocks in the middle of the cannon fire. Now the player is given the additional challenge of trying to navigate the room to collect the power-up without getting hit. Before we move the power-up, the player had no reason not to hit this block and collect it. But now the player is given the choice to risk getting the power-up or forgo it to get through the area quicker. These sorts of decisions are important to making the level feel polished and well designed. Next up, let's look at how to create interesting challenges for the player. Even with such simple gameplay, Super Mario still has a wide variety of challenge types to offer to the player. There are timing challenges, precision challenges, puzzle challenges, and more. A challenge should require the player to put what they've learned to the test. In a traditional Mario level, the player is continuously presented with obstacles to overcome, but the levels are designed to allow multiple approaches to the same challenge. If players aren't allowed to experiment and come up with their own solutions to problems, they will feel frustrated and feeling forced to find the way they are supposed to play the level. What makes Mario fun is analyzing the challenge put in front of you, and then using your understanding of the game and its mechanics to come up with a way to overcome it. Challenges can also act as a way to teach the player about important mechanics. This level opens up with a swinging claw that is required to reach the other platform. The challenge is figuring out how to reach the claw, and then how to use the claw to get to the other side. By restricting the rest of the level this way, you can guarantee that the player will understand a certain mechanic, and you as a designer are now free to use this mechanic however you want, and introduce completely new challenges that build off of the understanding that the player has acquired. Creating specific challenges will come down to what the level has and what mechanics you want the player to use. We'll get more into how to design challenges later on. Finally, a good level will provide the player with a variety of actions that they can use to overcome obstacles. Mario games already provide a decent variety of moves that the player can do, such as wall jumping, hopping on enemies, ground pounding, etc. You can design all of your challenges to revolve just around these options, but you can also use the level's mechanics to introduce even more actions. If your level does introduce new actions that the player can take, be sure to introduce them at the start of the level. For example, this level revolves around using the POW hat in the 3D world style. The POW hat is right in front of the player surrounded by question mark blocks. This grabs the player's attention and entices them to collect the hat. When they do, they are likely to hit their head on the ceiling, which will demonstrate how the POW hat works. From this very simple setup, we have effectively taught the player what the POW hat does and why it's useful. Just on its own, the power-up provides an additional option that the player can use to overcome obstacles and defeat enemies, with the added risk that there are a limited number of uses for the power-up, so the player might want to save this option for later. Giving the player options to overcome challenges allows players to express how they play, and enables different strategies with different pros and cons. It's important to make sure that the level does not make any specific action too good or too obvious. In the same POW Hat level, I had originally used regular bricks as the ceiling to emulate the original underground levels of Super Mario Bros. Since you can break these blocks with the POW Hat, players would easily break the ceiling and travel across the blocks, rendering the entire level design pointless. As a response, I had to use a different kind of block to seal off the top of the level to avoid creating a dominant strategy. When making challenges and actions, it's very important to design them in such a way as to reward creativity and to use multiple solutions. If one action becomes the end-all be-all solution to any challenge in the level, then the player no longer has a meaningful choice to make, and the game becomes less interesting. These are the basic principles of level design. By understanding these fundamental building blocks, you can already create interesting levels. But now let's take it a step further and look at how to make an interesting concept for a level, and how to use a level's unique mechanic to create challenges. Every level in Super Mario Bros. Has some mechanic that the entire level revolves around. The first thing that a level needs to do is establish what mechanic the player will be dealing with. This involves opening the level with a safe environment to allow the player to approach and learn about the new mechanic. If done correctly, the player should immediately know how the mechanic works and how best to utilize it. As the level progresses, it needs to build upon the mechanic that was introduced and provide challenges that require the player to use the mechanic to overcome them. At this point, the player is now at risk of failing, but the challenges should start off simple before getting increasingly more complex. Each challenge also needs to use the mechanic in a different way to provide variety, instead of just needing the player to do the same challenge over and over. This is a good time to introduce extra paths and optional rewards that the player can attempt to grab. The exact way you create these challenges are going to depend on the level's central mechanic and what the player is able to do with it. At some point in the level, you will need to provide a twist or some unique way of using the level's gimmick that forces the player to think about the mechanic in a new way. These are often the most memorable parts of levels, and a good twist can make the player appreciate the level's design even more. Finally, the level needs to have a big conclusion that uses everything the player has learned and ends the level. This part of the level will often allow the player to reach the top of the flagpole if they complete the challenge. It acts as a big release of tension and serves as the level's last hurrah before ending. Let's look at an example of what a Mario Maker level could look like with this design philosophy. This level is built entirely around the wind mechanic found in the nighttime version of the desert theme. The level starts with a large open area devoid of any enemies to allow the player to react to and get used to the mechanic. The wind makes everything in the level harder, as an element of control is being taken away from the player. Even the simple question block with a power-up in it acts as a challenge, since the player now has a harder time collecting it. As the level goes on, it introduces some more challenges to overcome with the wind. There's a segment where the player can try to hop on piranha plants to get a collectible, and the level introduces these bumpers which the player must platform on. There's a good variety of different obstacles to keep the player's attention and to get them to thinking about different ways this wind mechanic can be used. Halfway into the level, however, the player is now required to go against the wind, acting as this level's twist. Suddenly, the player needs to reconsider their approach to the same obstacles as before, with old challenges now becoming new and more difficult. Finally, the last segment ends off the level with a final platforming challenge, leading to a satisfying conclusion. If the player collected all 8 red coins hidden throughout the level, they can open this door for a bunch of goodies. This was just one example of a level. Every level from every Mario game follows this exact formula. It's one of the reasons why players keep coming back, as they like seeing all of the creative obstacles and levels that the dev team has to offer. By utilizing this same formula, you too can make incredible levels that are satisfying to complete. Moving on from basic principles in design, now let's introduce some advanced tips for making Mario levels. The first advanced tip to level design is framing. When presenting challenges to the player, it's important to make sure that all of the information the player needs is given to them. A player generally shouldn't have to do any guesswork to figure out what something in a level is doing. If a player can't see or doesn't know what to do, they may carelessly throw themselves at obstacles until something sticks, and trial and error is generally not a very fun process. Always make sure that the mechanic you want the player to learn is easy to see. A core tenet of level design is if the player didn't see something, then it didn't happen. For example, if hitting an on-off block didn't immediately change anything on the player's screen, then they might think that the block didn't do anything. If they run to the right and see that their path is blocked off, they'll be confused because they didn't know how the path became that way. An example of framing done right is this opening room. Here, the player is clearly presented with an on-off block, and when the player hits it, a platform starts moving up and allows the player to jump to the next platform. The player can clearly see that the on-off block activated the platform and has now learned what to look for when hitting these blocks in the future. It's also important to make sure that the player is able to react to anything when it appears on screen. If all of a sudden an enemy falls out of nowhere and hits them, the player is going to feel cheated because they could not have possibly predicted or reacted to the situation. If you are going to include things that the player must react to, be sure to give them plenty of time to think and condition them into reacting to things. Next on the list are power-ups and coins. Coins are an extremely versatile part of a designer's toolkit, as they can be used to mark paths the player can go to or to act as rewards for overcoming challenges. Players are naturally attracted to coins, so by placing them in certain spots, you can direct the player's attention. You can also use them to entice the player to do certain things, and make the player risk going out of their way to collect them. Be careful not to use too many coins, however, as placing coins absolutely everywhere actually diminishes their value. Coins are worth collecting because they are only in certain spots. If there are too many coins, then the player will not bother collecting ones that are out of their way, which means that the player will be less likely to take risks in the level. Power-ups are in a similar camp. They are generally used as a reward for the player when they complete a tough challenge, although some levels revolve around using power-ups in certain ways. It's usually a good idea to only have one kind of power-up in a level, as having too many different power-ups can make the level seem unfocused. Power-ups can also complement a level's design by giving the player additional options to overcome obstacles. Each power-up provides a unique way to interact with the level. The Fire Flower makes dealing with enemies significantly easier, so use this in levels where enemies are a part of the challenge. The Super Leaf and Cape both allow Mario to more easily move around in the air and stall his fall. They also let Mario fly if he gains enough speed. Use these if the level revolves more around platforming than fighting enemies. The Propeller, Wingsuit, and Catsuit fall into the same type of power-up as the Super Leaf and the Cape, but they give Mario some unique option to move around. There are several other types of power-ups at your disposal as well, so feel free to experiment and see which one works the best for your level. Power-ups should feel like a reward for accomplishing things, so don't just put power-ups everywhere. The more power-ups a level has, the easier it becomes, and vice versa. Additionally, players should have to put in work to get the higher tiers of power-ups, and there's this mechanic in Mario Maker that actually allows you to do this. You can make a power-up progressive by holding the A button on it and selecting the mushroom icon. Now when the power-up spawns, it will be a mushroom if the player is small, but appear normally if they are big. This technique rewards players for completing challenges without getting hit, and it makes the power-ups feel more rewarding to acquire. Up next is pacing. A level's pacing describes how often the player is met with new challenges, and how quickly the player moves from one challenge to the next. A level with good pacing will start off slow to introduce the level's mechanics, and then pick up speed to keep the player engaged and challenge them. When designing a level, always be sure to break up moments of fast gameplay or high challenge with breakpoints that allow the player to catch their breath. These often manifest as checkpoints, but they can also just be platforms without enemies on them. Breakpoints allow the player to regain their stamina between challenges, and prevents the player from feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. This castle level uses several breakpoints in between challenges to help the player get acquainted with their surroundings and allow them time to think of a strategy. The last advanced tip we'll talk about today is difficulty. Just like with pacing, a level should start off easy and get progressively more difficult as the level progresses, with brief moments of relief before amping up the action again. Difficulty is very difficult to get just right, as it is very easy to make a level that is too easy or too hard. This is the thing that will take the most amount of tweaking and testing in order to get just right. This problem is exacerbated even more in Mario Maker, since anyone of any skill level can play your level, but this doesn't mean that you need to design for every skill level. Easier levels allow more people to play and complete them, but are less satisfying to complete because the players aren't challenged enough. By contrast, harder levels can alienate players and reduce the amount that play your level, but will, if done right, be far more satisfying and fun to complete. There's a wide variety of different ways to make levels easier or harder. Making platforms larger or smaller will change the leniency that the player has to make jumps. Adding more enemies and pits means that the player has less breathing room and needs to be more careful about their movements. One big way to make a level more difficult is to restrict what the player can and cannot do to overcome challenges. The reason why dark levels are hard is because the player cannot see ahead of themselves and make informed decisions on what to do. Instead, they need to slowly inch their way through the level and use what they can see to make informed decisions about where to go. Difficulty is extremely hard to get just right, so don't feel bad if you don't get it on your first try. Lastly, I'd like to go over the importance of playtesting and how to implement changes based on feedback. You can design the most perfect level in your head, but until you get the level out for people to play, you'll just never truly know if your level is good or not. Playtesting is a great way to get some fresh eyes on your level, and you can catch a lot of issues with levels that you missed while creating it. Super Mario Maker 2 doesn't do a great job when it comes to feedback. It's really hard to know what players will struggle with ahead of time, and I'm actually not sure if you can even make changes to update your level after you post it. One way to get feedback is to just find people in real life to play your level. It can be family members, friends, or even just people you meet. The skill level of these players will vary wildly, so take that into consideration when getting people to play your levels. Some players just might not be skilled enough at Mario, and that's okay. You don't need to design every level for absolute beginners. Let's go over what to look for when people are playing your levels. As they play, you should not talk to your playtester or give any hints on the level. This is because someone who is playing your level in the real world most likely will not have you sitting next to them to ask for guidance. Look out for any areas that they get stuck on. This can be a sign that the challenge is either too hard or your level did not teach them how to use the mechanics properly. Sometimes players will just make mistakes and die, and that's okay. It's your job as a designer to determine if their failures were because of their own fault or if the level is built in a way that makes it easy to fail. You should also be listening out for engagement and seeing if they say anything out loud. If a player says, "Huh, that's interesting," then it's a good sign that they are engaged with the level. If they get upset and start blaming the level, then it could be a sign that the level is frustrating to play. You should also look out for what types of decisions players are making. If players unanimously choose one way of dealing with a challenge over another, it may be a sign that the actions the players can take are not balanced properly. Do players discover hidden areas? Do they collect power-ups? How do they deal with enemies? These questions can allow you to fine-tune your level and trim off any excess difficulty. After they are done playing your level, ask your playtesters how they felt. Ask them if they enjoyed the level or if they thought it was too hard or boring. Ask them to identify things they thought were cool or what parts they liked the most. It's more valuable to get feedback that's based on how a player feels, since we as game designers are attempting to invoke emotion and fun in the player. If players feel frustrated and stressed while playing, it can be a sign to go back and make the level easier or telegraph the challenges better. Some players may suggest making specific changes to a level, like "this jump should be easier," or "get rid of these enemies." When receiving this feedback, try to look at what the root cause of the player's complaint is. It may be a sign that the level does not introduce its mechanic well enough, or that the level doesn't make the player aware of their options to overcome challenges. Sometimes their feedback is correct, but you do not need to implement every single change that playtesters suggest. After getting your feedback, make the changes to the level that you feel players would appreciate. If a challenge is too hard, you can either make it easier by making the task more lenient, or you can introduce more options to tackle that challenge. You may find that a certain challenge has a dominant strategy that renders it trivial, in which case you need to address the actions a player can take and balance them accordingly. The exact changes are going to be up to you, but always remember to get more testing and feedback after making changes. Once you believe the level is just right, you can publish it for the world to see. One example of feedback I received for a level was in the checkpoint for the wind level. A playtester said that this jump with the claw was too difficult and suggested lowering the platform to make it easier. I took this feedback and instead opted to replace the claw with a vine, since I wasn't doing anything with the claws in the rest of the level, and vines were already established earlier. One final note regarding playtesting is that players do not know what will be in your level ahead of time, so their experience is going to be different from yours. It's very easy to get caught up in making changes and increasing difficulty because you already know every challenge in the level. You might feel that a challenge you present is trivial, so you start adding more and more enemies and obstacles to make the challenge harder. A person playing your level will not know what you will present to them, so the level is going to be inherently harder for them. It's easy to start designing levels for yourself rather than for others, and learning to design for others is one of the most important aspects of game design. Phew, we learned a lot today about making levels, game design, and player feedback. You should now have all of the tools you need to understand how to break down and construct great traditional Mario levels. I've left a bunch of resources in the description to aid with level design. I highly recommend learning more if you are interested, because learning level design also makes you a better game developer and increases your capacity for critical thinking. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this video gets enough good reception, I might even make a series going over different aspects of level design and how to construct different kinds of levels for different games. While Super Mario Bros. Is a very different game from The Last of Us or Splatoon, these core design principles that you've learned actually apply to all video games. The concept of risk versus reward and challenges and actions carries over to all types of games. It's what makes them games after all. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.